Hello and welcome to the DRF webinar on using race-shaped symbols. This is Mike Hogan, Director of Product Marketing at Daily Racing Form, and it's my pleasure today to be joined by Kenny Peck, DRF handicapper and the architect behind the race-shaped symbols. Welcome, Kenny.
Hey, Mike, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm all right.
So I'm excited that we're going to be able to talk about and get questions from the audience about the race-shaped symbols. Since these are a relatively new addition to the DRF PPs and currently only exist in the DRF Classic PPs, although really in the next few days they should be available in Formulator as well. So we're going to go through just kind of an overview of what they are, how they're created, the methodology behind them, how people should use them in their handicapping. We're going to show a few recent examples, and we're also going to look at the Derby contenders using those symbols to potentially upgrade or downgrade recent efforts. So should be fun, and I want to mention to anybody, you can ask any questions throughout the webinar. We'll get to them at the end, although if there are any that come through that seem to be relevant about what we're talking about, I may chime in and ask them as we go. But the way you submit them is through the webinar chat panel on the right of your screen. Just send your questions along. They'll be passed through to me, and we'll get to them when we can. All right, Kenny, so let's give a little bit of an overview of what these symbols are, how people use them, what they do and what they don't do.
Okay, what they attempt to do is identify the race flow for a given race, which means if the race favored closers or speeds, or whether sometimes it's neutral, sometimes it's too hard to determine. We tried to just identify those races that were extreme scenarios that either favored closers greatly or speeds greatly, and it does that by looking at the composition of the race, how many speeds are in it, and then how the race ultimately does shape up. So we look at it in two different ways. We look at it pre-race, how the race is expected to run, and as well as post-race, how the race is actually run.
Right. So let me make sure I understand completely. So what you do is prior to the race, you look at the running style of the horses entered, and if there's, let's say 4 or 5 entered that seem to be early pace setters on or near the lead in all of their recent races at the same distance, that's a race that might be flagged as one likely to set up for closers or one likely to have a pretty tough early pace to set things up for ones rallying from off the pace. So you flag it prior to the race, and then after the race you look at the chart to see if indeed it did match that early race expectation, and if so, that's when it gets the C, or the C with the circle, where it favored closers or extremely favored closers. Do I have it correctly?
Yeah, we've all seen those races where you look at the race prior to its running and you say, wow, this race really looks like I might set up for the closers. There's 4 speeds in here. It's a route race. It's a couple of horses stretching out. This looks to me like the closers are going to have the edge in here. So we look at that and label that race internally. Once the race is then run, it looks at the chart and sees if the race was in fact run that way. If the closers did have the advantage, if the speeds did have trouble holding on, and then we can safely say, you know what, the race shaped up this way prior to its running. The chart says that it ran this way. We're comfortable saying that this was a race that set up well for the closers. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that the horse that won the race came from well off the pace. We wanted to make sure that we were able to recognize those horses who outran the race shape, who were maybe in this case were on the lead and held on really well. That doesn't disqualify the race as a race. That doesn't say, hey, the pre-race label was wrong. What it's saying is that horse ran a particularly good race. We wanted to recognize that, and we put into the algorithm a lot of language that would enable us to look at other horses in the race, the second and third place finishers, and what did happen to the speed horses, other speed horses in the race, because we wanted to make sure we didn't throw all the horses out just because, or throw the race out just because one horse happened to outrun the race shape.
Right, right. Well, let's move on, and we've got a slide here asking about how they're created, and I wanted to be sure we went over what they do as well as what these race shape symbols do not do in the algorithm. And one thing that we want to make clear from the start is you're not talking about fraction, because they're listed in there, and you can see, oh, it was 20 and 4, 40. 44 and 3, you know, that seems to be a very fast pace. These symbols are not taking any of that into account, right?
Absolutely not. I mean, we have pace figures. We have very good pace figures and Moss pace figures. And this is not looking to be a pace figure by any means. It's race flow, which is a whole different concept. It's about how the race shaped up, and we wanted to make sure we got it right, so we looked at the pre-race and the post-race. I mean, it would have been easy to write relatively easy to write a program looking at the chart and saying, hey, this race shaped up for closers. Well, in fact, if you looked at the composition of the race, it just happened to be that's the way the chart looks. We wanted to have it pre-race and post-race match up, so we knew we were going to be accurate when we put these labels on.
Right, and this system has gone through and looked at every race in North America since the start of 2015. So every race, regardless of where it was run, whether it was run on the smaller fair circuits in Oregon or if it was run at Belmont Park, every one of these was run through and graded, either given a neutral grade, which is it wasn't necessarily favoring closers or speed, or given an S, a circle S, or a C, or a circle C. That, and regardless of whether, even if the timer malfunctions, the race is still graded and given a rating. Is that correct?
That's correct. We're looking at running styles and race flow, and there's a lot that goes into it in terms of you have things like like I said, stretch outs, you have blinkers, you have horses off the layoff, you have horses that don't break well. So there was a lot that went into trying to look at every possible scenario to make this as accurate as possible. And the fact that we have the chart check, I'm comfortable with, and it's been very successful in labeling races correctly. But the pre-race stuff is what's most important, because it identifies the race ahead of time, and when the race is then run, to have that verification process, to me, it gives it a lot of credibility, because the race is actually run the way we expected it to be run.
Right, and I mentioned it's the symbols are added for every race that's run in North America since the start of 2015. But actually, in the testing, you guys went back and looked at every race run in North America for the last 5 years, right? So this is not something where you were looking at a very small sample size before we added it to the PPs. This is something that was tested and tweaked and analyzed and changed and really labored over before there was a decision that, okay, we feel good about these results and we want to make sure we're adding them to the past performances.
Yes,
right?
the labels were only added since 2015, but we went back. It goes back and looks at races at least 5 years back. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's move on. Again, the question of how people, that's great they're in here. How do you suggest people use them as a new tool within their handicapping? And ultimately, they're, without putting words in your mouth, they're essentially meant to either upgrade, downgrade, or even forgive certain previous races and past performances, right?
Yeah, you could use them in a lot of different ways. A lot of times people will use, I've heard people using them to try to assess how a horse is going to run today based on his last couple of races. And when you say forgive, that's a very good example. When you'll see a horse who's typically showing speed and all of a sudden he's 5th or 6th, and there'll be no comment in the comment line that there was a poor start or something, a lot of times you'll think, the horse wasn't fast enough, or he just something went wrong. But if it turns out that it's a race that greatly favored those horses who were coming off the pace, that means that there was a lot of speed in the race. And you could say, well, there's a built-in excuse. There's a horse who couldn't make the lead because there was so much speed in the race. Now today, he ends up in a race without a lot of pace. You could expect that horse to be on the lead. So it's a way to project running style, to help project running styles. And that's one of the key ways that I like to use it is to look for horses who have built-in excuses that aren't apparent. and that's what it kind of
Right.
does. It shows you races where instances where a horse may have an excuse where otherwise it wasn't apparent.
Right. Well, we've got a few examples. Let's take a look at before we jump and look at the contenders for the Kentucky Derby. One recent example is a runner that was entered at Oaklawn Park not too long ago, Corsa Veloce. You want to talk a little bit about this one?
Yeah, this is a real good example, and this one kind of stings because I missed it. I was sitting in a ballroom in Vegas planning the contest, and I didn't use it, and I kicked myself for a week afterward. Corsa Veloce is a good example because the last two races, this horse had symbols that suggested that she had an excuse in those races. The S means that the race flow favored speeds. And this is a horse coming from off the pace in those races. And it can even excuse these races where the horse is badly beaten. But in this particular case, 34 lengths and 25 lengths, really had little chance there. And you'll see that she was well bet in those races. Going back further, back on May 18th, the H symbol suggests that those horses that were close to the pace were at a disadvantage. And there she was, 2.5 off and then a length off. A pace that doesn't look very fast on its surface. 24, 3, 48, and 3 are not very fast fractions. But the symbols tell you that the race set up well for those horses coming from off the pace. Same thing on the February 20th race. The H symbol, this horse was ninth early, but was 5 lengths off the lead. You know, this is not, and ended up backing up. These are races where you can find an example. Now, you find the races where there are no symbols, and it's important to note that this doesn't mean that the race was neutral. It means that we couldn't accurately, in our minds, put a label on the race. In those races,
wasn't extreme one way or another. Yeah,
exactly. It doesn't necessarily mean neutral, but it could be neutral. In those races, Corsa Veloce actually won both of the races. Then turns up in this race at Oaklawn and is basically dismissed because those last two running lines look pretty poor on their surface. The one at Saratoga and the Indiana Downs race, badly beaten in both, and then comes back at Oaklawn, I think it was on March 31st, I believe, and gets a favorable race flow.
I'll show you. So real quick, I'll mention these. The H symbols here have now been changed to C. So the H doesn't exist anymore. I think this is an older example of the PPs. These are now, these would be Cs if you were looking at Corsa Veloce's PPs now. But we look at that last race on September 18th at Indiana Grand, where she was unable to rally from off the pace. This is a race where a horse wired the field. And this is a race that didn't necessarily favor those from coming off the pace. Then she gets into a race that's maybe a little more evenly or even more likely to favor closers in this case. And this is where Corsa Veloce was able to rally, get up by a neck, and pay a very nice $42.20 to win.
Yeah, it's very much a yin and yang thing with the pace handicapping. You can come out of a race that you don't have the flow in your favor, and then you come back in another race where you don't have the flow in your favor again, and then it's not so important. But you got to find those races where you come from an unfavorable race flow to a positive one, and that's exactly what happened here. And like you were saying earlier, how do you use them? Well, you use them, like you said, to find excuses for horses. You can use them to project pace. But to me, the best way to use them is to find horses that are going from an unfavorable scenario to a favorable one.
Right, right. All right, let's look at another example. We have Emotional Drive, who was a runner in Southern California, coming out of a race where it favored closers in the prior start, and she was not able to get the early lead, unlike 4 of her previous efforts where she was very forwardly placed. In some cases, when she wired the field, in other cases when she was badly beaten after tiring, maybe going a little too long. Comes out of that race, you see it gets the C. We'll look and see why it gets the C. This is a race where the horse setting the early pace held on for second, but those dueling with the pace setter finished 5th and 6th. Really the only horse from early on the early pace that stayed on was the second place finisher, and you had a couple rallying at bigger odds to round out the try and the super there. So Emotional Drive wasn't able to get that lead, finished last, then fell into a race where it was a little bit more favorable from a pace standpoint, and she went on to win at a big price.
Well, that's a good example. If you go back to that previous chart, you know, the subtleties of it are that it looks like this race is a two-speed number. There's two horses that finished first and second that were close to the pace, but the pre-race analysis said that these horses ran really well because there was a lot of pace in the race. So the third and fourth finishes come from well off the pace, enough so that the program identifies the race. Even though the horses who ran second was on a lead early on, it still says these horses who ran third and fourth were set up by this fast pace. It qualifies as a race that comes up as a C. So it's not as easy as just looking at the chart. The pre-race analysis, judging how much pace is in the race prior to the race, is the most important thing, because you can't just look at the chart on its surface and come up with a determination.
Right. Right. Well, let's look at one more example before we jump over to the Derby contenders. This is a runner, Fortuitous Path, who was racing at Aqueduct, coming off of a very convincing win and a career top buyer of 97 in a race where seemingly he was benefited by a favorable pace scenario that really strongly favored closers, and he won at odds of 8-5. And then was showing up again. We'll show why that race. This is the chart of the race where he won at 8-5. You'll see the three that were last early on finished 1, 2, 3, and those setting the pace fell way back, and even the runner that set the early pace maybe outran it a little bit to even hang on to finish fourth. Then he landed in a race as the favorite at Aqueduct on March 20th and didn't get nearly the same setup, and was bet down to almost 7-5, just over 6-5, and finished fourth.
Yeah, if you look at that previous race that Fortuitous Path came out of, again, look at the fractions on the surface. Doesn't seem like a blistering pace, but the pre-race analysis said this was a race with a lot of speed, and it was. You had a duel, you had a horse that was set up. And if you go back to the PPs, it's a way to use the race shapes together with buyers. Both of the top buyers that Fortuitous Path has earned came in situations where he was greatly aided by the race flow. You can see the two inverted C's, and the two buyers in 97 and 94 hasn't really been able to approach those figures in other races when he hasn't had the race flow in his favor. So this is a prime example of a horse to bet against in his next start, as long as he doesn't get another inverted C-type scenario. As long as there's not another race where there's like 4 speeds in it, he's going to be set up again. And that's exactly the case when he came out of that race into the next one.
Right. So it's great to find winners. Sometimes you find those winners. It's hard to find the 20-to-1 winners like Corsa Veloce and Emotional Drive. As much as anything, sometimes these are tools that help you knock short-priced favorites that might be up against it from a race flow standpoint in the race where they're going to get bet down to 6-5. That's in many ways just as valuable as finding a winner.
Absolutely. When you're looking for horses to bet against, you look at a favorite, and you see that he was with the race flow in his previous race where he earned that big buyer. That, in and of itself, is enough of a reason to start to try to find a way to bet against that horse. And as long as the race flow is not again in his favor, he's a prime horse to bet against.
Right. All right. Let's jump over to the Kentucky Derby field. Of course, we don't have the post positions yet, so this is the advanced Derby PPs that you would get if you purchased the Kentucky Derby package from drf.com. It has all 24 runners that are likely to make the also eligibles, assuming there are no scratches, and they're in order of points. So Gun Runner, who has the most points, is the first one at the top of the list. We'll just kind of go through the field and take a look at these. I'll also mention we had a question out there about, since the race flow symbols are not in Formulator yet, they should be added quite soon. Even still, prior to that, you're able, if you have a Formulator subscription, you're able to access any of the DRF Classic PPs with your Formulator subscription. So just because you're maybe a formulator user doesn't mean you don't have access to these. So Kenny, let's go through the field, and we can talk real quickly about some of the runners. Gunrunner, you see, had a race in the Risen Star that seemed to favor closers. Nyquist has had some running styles that have favored both closers and speed extremely. Are there any knocks, as your likely and perhaps even legitimate short-priced favorite in the Derby, any knocks from a race flow standpoint that you can see on Nyquist?
No, I like Nyquist. I think my only problem with Nyquist is, not problem, but my concern with Nyquist is that he wants to be close up and how much speed is going to be in the race. It looks like there's not going to be all that much speed, historically speaking, in the Derby. His last race with the inverted C was a very big race. He was on the lead there and fought off pressure. The race two back, he was with the flow, but that's a 7-furlong race at San Vicente. And he was with the flow in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. His last race, however, is what really, to me, stands out. It makes him the top contender in the race, especially now that the Derby's not shaping up to be a speed-filled race. If you go back up again to Gunrunner, he was a horse I was very much against in the Louisiana Derby, and he ended up winning the race rather easily via another perfect trip. But he's a horse that I'm against. I was against because of his trip in the Risen Star, a race that set up well for closers. A couple of horses, a couple of the speeds in that race that I was interested in that actually came out of that race and ran well. But this is what I'm saying about, like, you got to kind of use the tool just as a tool. It's not like the end result. So
right.
Yeah, Gunrunner comes out of the race. You're betting against him. You got to realize in the Louisiana Derby he had another perfect trip. He's a horse that I wouldn't use again next time out. Whether it be the Derby or wherever he came back. If it's a race on any given Saturday or in a Kentucky Derby, because even without the race shape symbols, the Louisiana Derby is a perfect trip. The race two back obviously had flow in his favor. He's a horse to bet against. Nyquist, I would not bet against because of that big effort in his latest.
Right. Yeah. No, you make a good point. These aren't meant to be a magic bullet that are meant to cross out or validate certain things. They're ones that maybe make you upgrade or downgrade slightly. But even with the case with Gunrunner, even where he was potentially benefiting from the race flow in the Risen Star, that was still his first start off of, as a 3-year-old, first start off of a little bit of a layoff. So even with the benefit of the race flow, perhaps he moved forward a little bit in the second start off the layoff. Perhaps he got a similar trip. You can still make a case that even if he was in benefit of the race flow, that there still could be another move forward coming. And it's just another piece of your handicapping arsenal. That doesn't mean that you were going to toss completely, or doesn't mean that you're going to make a case for a horse you don't like on paper anyway. I think that's something that people don't necessarily understand about the symbols.
Yeah, well, it could be that he trips out again in the Derby. I mean, it depends. He's a horse with a little bit of tactical speed. If the race comes up and there's not a lot of pace in it, there's a horse that you might give pause to throwing out because, if he draws well and he's got the speed to stay close and the fraction's figured to be controlled, then you can't really throw him out. But you're looking for scenarios where you can, with confidence throw certain horses out and whether. So let's go on to exaggerate. Suppose that the Derby comes up, right? And it does lack speed, and on paper there's not a lot of speed in it. He's a horse that I would definitely downgrade because his last two races he was with the flow in both of them. The race 3 back in the San Vicente, he was close up to a race of favored speeds. 3 races in a row, he's with the flow. He's earning big figures. I would probably not. I'm definitely not going to use exaggerating the Derby if it does shape up that way where he figures to have to close into a controlled pace. I mean, this to me is probably the best example. Now, am I saying exaggerated can't win? Absolutely not. But if the race shapes up as expected, he's going to have a tough time closing into those fractions without the benefit of the race flow in his favor.
Right, and it's another good point to make is Andy Beyer in his book Picking Winners talks about horses that are able to put in top efforts when they're have everything their own way, and you could make the case that the 103 Beyer is not a bad buyer. It's an act, it's an actual figure and it's a legitimate figure, but it's a figure where Exaggerator earned it by having everything in his own favor, and you have to question, as you've done, whether or not he's likely to have that same scenario happen again in the Derby against 19 other colts, where he might have to rally from off the pace and maybe hit traffic or maybe doesn't get as strong a pace. This is where you have to wonder, is he able to duplicate that effort, that 103 top blast out buyer in the field, when he had it all his own way in the last start?
Absolutely, and that's how you use them in conjunction with the buyers. You get a horse with a top buyer, and you can immediately see, did this horse have something in his favor that made it ideal circumstances? Most of the time, it's almost all the time, it's trip or flow. And this is a horse that you could expect to probably regress off that buyer. Outwork's a horse that's interesting to me. I was against him in the Wood because I thought the race there was a lot of speed in the race, and it turns out that there was. He just outran it. He was just very game to win that race, obviously.
Right.
And that was a race that was set up for closers behind him, but that doesn't diminish the fact that he ran a big race, that he outran the pace label. He's a very interesting horse to me as a pace candidate, especially off that last effort, which was really solid given the race flow.
Right, and it's not necessarily to say that he is going to be on the lead in the Derby or anything like that, but what it is saying to me at least is that the effort that he got, the 93 that he got, was in a race that didn't necessarily favor those with his running style. And he may be third or fourth or fifth even, but if he's able to get a trip that allows him to use his energy a little bit more evenly, that's one where you could make a case that he goes back to and maybe improves off of that 98 that he earned in the Tampa Derby, losing to his stablemate, who we'll face again on next Saturday.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a horse that you could expect, in my opinion, to move up off that 93 buyer, just because of the difficulty he had in that race. He was very game, and there are people who take the opposite view and think that it was a taxing effort and he may not run back to it. I would think that he's going to come back and with a more favorable trip, probably outrun that figure.
Yeah, this is a Derby that, if the field stays together the way it looks like it is right now, is going to have quite a few closers in here. And Brody's Cause is one of them. Creator is another. These are closers that were coming out of Derby preps where there was a lot of early speed that set it up for them. But of course, the way the point system is, those early speed rivals finished well out of the money, therefore didn't earn enough points to enter into the Derby. They're not going to be facing the same runners that they saw in the Bluegrass or the Arkansas Derby. What is your take on these Brody's Cause, Creator, Sudden Breaking News, some of these stone closers that seemingly got setups in previous starts? Are you against them completely? Are you how are you approaching it from a pace handicapping and race flow handicapping standpoint?
Well, this is also where you use it as a tool with other factors, including the buyers. Now you see, Brody's Cause has never really run a race fast enough to win the Derby, and that's despite some really favorable scenarios in terms of pace and race flow, including his last in the Bluegrass. Those of us who handicapped, we all saw the race in his latest and handicapped it and saw how the race was likely to shape up. And it shaped up perfectly for him, and he took advantage. But the 91 buyer has to make you think that this horse isn't going to be fast enough to win the Derby, because even with everything in his favor, that's all he was able to put up in the Bluegrass, and he's going to have to run a lot faster than that in the Derby, where he's not likely to get a favorable scenario. Creator's a little bit of a different situation, because the race flow wasn't quite as extreme favoring as it was with Brody's Cause in the Bluegrass when he won the Arkansas Derby. It was a race that set up for closers, sure, and the pace was fast, and that certainly helped him. But the 96 buyer is a little bit better than what Brody's Cause had put up. He is an absolute stone-cold closer, just like Brody's Cause, so he is going to need pace help. It's the kind of situation where when the race is drawn, if there's not a lot of speed in the race, this is not a horse that I want to use at any kind of single-digit odds.
Right, right, and but on the flip side, this seems to be an improving colt who took a little while to break his maiden, and since he has run better in each of his subsequent starts. He's what's that, 5 starts in a row where he's improved his Beyer speed figure. If you can project, and it's a big if, but if you can project a similar improvement in the Derby, and he's able to run an effort that is 102, 104, 106. That potentially is good enough to win the Kentucky Derby.
Yeah, but on the counter side of that is the fact that at least the last 2 races were races where he was flattered by the race flow, where
Right.
especially latest in the Arkansas Derby. So if he doesn't get that again, that step forward is going to make it hard to come by.
Right. Exactly. All right. Let's keep going. We don't necessarily have to talk about every runner in the race, but as I scroll through, just stop if there's anybody that you want to discuss a little bit, either as a positive upgrade or as somebody that you're downgrading in the Derby.
Well, Danes and Candy is a horse that I'm interested in a little bit just because of the way the race is not overloaded with speed. Not to say that the Danes and Candy is a prime win candidate, but it's a horse that can maybe hang on for a share at a big price if, in fact, the race doesn't it doesn't project to have a lot of pace in it. The last 2 races for Danes and Candy, clear excuses based on the race shape symbols. 2 back in the San Felipe, outran the symbol because that race only had 6 horses in it. There were 3 pure speeds in that race that were looking for the lead. The fact that Dan's and Candy's able to outrun them and hang on, I thought was a big effort. Same thing in the San Anita Derby. There was a lot of speed in that race. And looking at the PPs without the race shape symbols, you think, well, this horse blew a clear lead, and now it's running back against Exaggerated, beat him by 13 lengths. The fast fractions make it obvious that the pace setters were up against it there. The 45-1, and you don't need any race shape symbols to tell you that was a race set up for the closers. But if this horse is able to slow things down a little bit, and the race, in fact, does not shape up with a lot of speed, it's a horse I would expect to bounce back off that San Anita Derby. And ask him prior, how do you best use him? Here's a horse, you're looking for horses that are going to improve off their last races. Danzig Candy's a horse who's probably going to improve off that 83 Beyer, and that's where you get your prices, because people, tend to overbet runners off their last races and their last Beyers in particular. Here's a horse who's going to really move forward off that race. And like I said, is he good enough to win? That's debatable. But the fact that this is a horse who's probably going to improve off his latest and be a big price is a horse I would be interested in using.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point about the speed of that last race. And we had a question from Guy Keys wanting to know how these will work with the Moss pace figures. And Dan's and Candy's race in the Santa Anita Derby is a good example. I don't obviously have Formulator up, so I don't have the Moss pace figures here. But this is where you would have in Formulator the C and then the Moss pace figures showing that this was indeed a fast early pace that really did set up for closers. That's where you get that convergence when you see something where, yes, your analysis pre and post race said it would set up for closers. The Moss pace figures validate that. That's when you get everything coming together, and you do feel much more confident that this is something where Dancing Candy is certainly going to improve off that 83 Beyer, all things being equal. Whether or not he's good enough to win the Derby is another question.
Absolutely. I mean, you're looking for horses who are going to outrun their previous couple of lines, and you could find an example every day, not every race, but every day, where you could find a price on a horse that had an excuse in his last race because of race flow, and now you could get a decent price on it.
Yeah. Yep. All right. Let's keep scrolling through. Tell me to stop at any of the horses you want to discuss. We do have a number of questions. Please keep submitting them. We'll have time to get to them before we wrap today. But I do have a queue that I will get to when we're done looking at the Derby contenders.
Sudden breaking news is another horse set up by the race flow in the Arkansas Derby. And, it's kind of apparent when you see these horses that all happen to finish, close up that were way back early on. Obviously, the race set up for closers. The value of the race shapes is in where those situations occur, but the fractions weren't obvious. So like we showed earlier in the example, a horse could have relatively modest looking fractions and have a legit excuse in that, the race shaped up not according to how the fractions played out, but according to the race flow. And that's
Right.
where we get away from the fractions, and you can find just all you need is one little nugget to find. And in this case with race shapes, they're easier to unearth by using them.
Right.
So sudden breaking news was behind a 46.5 last time. It's kind of obvious. All right, maybe the race should have set up for closers. The 47 in the Southwest isn't as obvious, but that was clearly a race based on the race-shaped symbols that set up well for closers in the inverted C.
Right. Right. Yeah, and you can see that in the fractions are at least are very similar. In fact, they appear to be slightly faster in the Rebel, a race that came up as ungraded, as opposed to the Southwest, where it was extremely favoring closers. So, yeah, fractions help, but it's not really the whole picture, which is why these symbols are really key.
Yeah, the fractions and the must-pace figures will match up many times with the race-shaped symbols, but the times that they don't are the times when you can really have an edge.
Yeah, let's go back through the rest of the field. We're getting into some of the more fringe contenders in a way, although I do want to talk a little bit, unless you have somebody else you want to discuss prior.
One second. Tom's Ready's a horse that I liked in this last race. If you want to go back to that one.
Yeah.
The Risen Star, you think the horse is on the lead. The Risen Star is a race that's set up for closers, including gun run. That's why I said I was against him in the Louisiana Derby, and he ended up beating me there. I was wrong. But Tom's Runner was a horse who was not on the lead, but he's close up to the pace, closer than he really normally is. And to me, he was kind of a pace casualty, and I did pick him in the Louisiana Derby. I was pleased the way he ran. He ran really well for second, but he's probably not fast enough to win the Derby, but I'm just talking as a general example. It doesn't necessarily mean those horses who are on the lead in a closer's race that you have to upgrade. It's also horses who were close up that ended up losing ground, like in this particular case in the Risen Star, that you can find an excuse for him. You can see he generally runs buyers in the mid-80s. That race, he didn't run anything close to that, and some handicappers might have looked at that and said, he was overmatched in there. He's not good enough. So he comes back losing a Derby, goes off 30-1. Meanwhile, he got a much better race flow. He wasn't close up to fast fractions as he was in the Risen Star. That is a built-in excuse that before the race shapes wasn't readily apparent.
Right, and he's a Dallas Stewart runner who's eligible for an N1X. So you're keying him for second, right?
We've seen that before, right?
All right, I wanted to move on before we get to the questions, unless there's another horse in the race that you want to talk about. I want to talk about Motom, who seems to be a lot of people's wise guy horse. He was on the 21 on the list, so he needed a little bit of help. He got some help when Cupid scratched, so he's 20th on the list. He will see the starting gate, all things being equal, next Saturday. He's won off of those last two races where he's had legitimate trouble that was seen by even people that don't necessarily follow racing. What's your take on Motom? Do you think he's an absolute contender if he gets a clean trip, or do you see him as one who's just kind of against it a little bit from the race flow?
It depends on the race flow shapes up. He's looking to come off the pace, but he's everybody's pick because, like you just said, the trouble was so obvious, and everybody saw what happened there. Trip horses tend to get overbet, especially in high-profile races like that. This horse has a lot of upside. I mean, you don't know how fast and how well he can run with a clean trip. I would not knock anybody for using him, based on race flow or anything, because we don't know how good he is with a clean trip from start to finish. He's been working pretty well from what everybody's saying, and he's another horse who's going to be he's come from well back, so I would look for a price just because of the race flow, but I wouldn't discount him based on any of his last couple of races.
All right, well, let's get to a few questions. We have a little bit of time left. We'll probably wrap early unless we get some other questions here, but we've got quite a few, so I want to make sure we spend enough time to answer them all adequately. And Bert Mason wants to know a little bit more about the criteria used for analyzing the races and determining whether or not they get marked with a C or an S or a more extreme version of it. Is it set up is it analyzed only by a computer? Are people looking at it afterwards to validate things? How does that, can you explain the process a little bit about how it assigns a rating scale to each of the races?
Yeah, sure. Every race, I just said, is looked at by the program, which was written, not, believe me, written by guys much smarter than me. Nobody's looking for me to write programs. I had some input with the guys with things we were looking for. I had some input with the testing. But the algorithm was written so that it analyzed first the running styles of horses, and it would project pace based on the horses' running styles in the race. There was no human intervention in it at all after the fact that after the program is written. Obviously, there's human intervention there, but now the race is run and the chart comes out. There is none at all. Just it runs on its own every day that we have racing. The chart specs are much the same thing. We decided to come up with a program that would look for how a race was run and then determine if it in fact matched up with the pre-race analysis. If it does match up, then it goes forward as the pre-race pace label. If it does not match up, then the race is not rated. It's rated as neutral or nothing comes up. We have to have both of those two things matching. If the pre and post race do not match, then there is no pace label assigned. There's nobody looking at the races to say, hey, this is wrong or that's right. We do have, since it's just been launched, we have been looking at races very closely to try to find any bugs or anything we may have missed in the testing we've done. There hasn't really been any of that. There's a couple of instances where we had things that we wanted to make changes to that were kind of minor, that changed a handful of races. Other than that, there really is no human intervention at all. It's just computer generated based on the program.
Great. And we had a question from Michael Owens who wanted to know, generally, do you have a sense of what percentage of races do match up and receive a grade or are running as the pre-race analysis had indicated that they might?
I think we're around 25%, something like that from what I've heard, which is about right, because I've been doing this a long time manually when I handicap races for the paper, probably for the last 15, 20 years. Probably 20 years or so, I've been doing exactly this by hand. It's obviously very labor intensive, and I have found much the same. Like about a quarter of the races merit some type of label, whether it be plus. In my case, I did in my chart book minus speed or minus speed, which would equate to S or inverted S here, or plus speed and plus speed for my own labeling. That's about where it should be, I think. And I think if you try to label too many races, then you end up putting out erroneous information. We're not trying to like fine tune it to the point where we have 50% of the races, because then you start putting out information that's not correct when you're trying to just label too many more. Yeah, we'll probably catch a couple that right now are neutral that we could probably put a label on, but we don't want to mislabel races. So
right.
Yeah, you want to extreme.
You want to flag ones that stand out.
Yeah, the intent was to flag the races that were extreme one way or the other, and then we ended up going a little bit further with races we were comfortable with labeling, but I think we've gone pretty far as much as we want to go with it before we start running into situations where you're not comfortable with the information.
Right, right. So we have a few questions from Plodboy Jake, who first he wants to know, he says, I presume a race of first-time starters can never be projected to be speed or closer favoring. Is that correct? You're not going back after, say, Saratoga, looking at all these first-time starters, reviewing the race 4 months later and realizing, wow, a lot of these horses in here seem to be horses that wanted the lead in their subsequent starts. You're not doing anything like that, right?
No. What did happen was in assessing races, how they're run, we all realized that, for example, turf routes, if you have a bunch of firsters in the turf route, generally speaking, you're not going to have a lot of horses busting out of the gate. So we would probably, I don't know exactly the parameters, but I remember in that particular case we had a provision that if we might have put a minus speed on a race or a minus, I forget what the numbers with the pace points and that kind of stuff was exactly. But if the race then turned out to favor speeds and none of the firsters showed speed, and a race flow did favor those horses close up, I think we might have a situation for that particular instance for turf routes with a lot of firsters where we could put a label on a race, feel comfortable putting a label on it if it's shaped up that way according to the chart. Otherwise, no.
Right.
I think I don't know exactly the particulars, to be honest with you, but if a race has X number of first-time starters in it, then we especially for certain dirt sprints, then the race isn't going to be pre-race labeled.
I gotcha. So in races with a lot of first-time starters, you lean less heavily on that pre-race analysis and maybe focus a little bit more on what the chart looks like.
Only in the turf routes. In the turf route,
okay.
Vision
Makes
for
sense.
that. Yeah. Maybe the dirt routes, but I can't be 100% sure. That's those guys. There was a lot of tinkering and stuff. I do remember the turf routes being a race where we were comfortable writing something pre-race about the turf route races.
Gotcha. So Jake also wants to know about releasing the pre-race assessments. You mentioned those. Any plans to release those?
Well, here's the thing. I mean, that's conjecture, and it's something that I'd rather not. We wanted to keep it stuff that was factual as much as possible, and while people would say, well, race shapes aren't factual, well, when you have the chart checking against it and you have the pre-race determination, you have two things coming together with a chart check, then I'm comfortable saying, like, this is how the race shaped up. Like, we're comfortable putting that on there. When you have a pre-race assessment, that's more of conjecture to me, first of all, that without any kind of, like, checking and any kind of factual basis, I'm not real comfortable doing that personally. Not that it's up to me anyway. Secondly, I think you could confuse some people when you end up having scratches, and then what do you do with the AEs, and then what do you do with the MTOs? And I had somebody come to me in Vegas with that argument and saying, well, when you put it in Formulator, then you can do it because you can change it based on scratches and stuff, and that's true, and that may end up being what may end up happening. But in terms of the print product, to print something 3 days ahead of time with a pace projection, based on running styles, and the last thing we want to do is throw people off. One scratch can change the whole dynamic of the race, and most people that buy our paper know that, but some people don't. So I'm not really wild about that part of it because of that, because I'm worried about putting somebody in the wrong frame of mind based on the race flow, and then one horse comes out and the whole thing's different.
Right, and let's clarify, when we talk about the pre-race analysis, we're actually talking about something that's done after the race, but what it's doing is it's looking at all the horses that actually ran in that race. Because you bring up a good point. The pre-race analysis the day before, or even the morning of, if there's a gate scratch, say, might benefit closers or speed horses. But it looks at the actual horses that ran and said, okay, of these, there was only one that even sniffed the early lead in previous starts. So yeah, I understand it does get a little dangerous, especially with AEs, especially with scratches, about doing that. All right, Jake had one more question. He wanted to know, do you ever consider the running surface, whether it was speed favoring on a given day or a race, or if the surface itself seemed to favor closers or speed?
That's a good question. That's something that we talked about extensively, and that may be something that we roll out with phase 2 with that. But again, we didn't want to get too much into the guesstimate of it, and I know that Jake has a product that does just that, and it's a very good one. But we wanted to stay as close as possible to the facts, so to speak. I mean, we didn't want to have somebody's opinion that the race favored this or that, or one running style or another, or inside or outside. And while that can be done, and it's proven it can be done, that's a huge undertaking, and something that will probably be done down the line once we feel comfortable with being able to. I don't know if we'll ever feel comfortable being able to assess biases at scale it across all tracks. If we do, though, I'd like to eventually get something in there related to biases, but I would not want it to be subjective by any means.
Right. All right. Aaron Shapiro wants to know, would you upgrade or downgrade horses switching surfaces who were against the flow in prior races?
Well, you have to kind of look at the race individually. You know, if the horse is coming off a turf race where, you know, he was against the flow and I'm looking to bet him back, now he's in a dirt sprint, you know, you got to handicap the race. You got to look at the horse as an individual and look at the horse's previous sprint races. If he's never sprinted before, I would use it as an excuse if he was against the flow in his last race and come back into a sprint, sure. But, you know, it all goes hand in hand with everything else. What price is he? And, you know, does he seem to have a sprint pedigree, or, you know, whatever the case may be. I would certainly use it with confidence if a horse is coming out of, say, a dirt route and had a pace excuse and now is going on the turf and is bred for the turf. I wouldn't discount it. I wouldn't just completely ignore it. I would definitely use it as an excuse if I like the horse otherwise. No doubt about it.
All right, John Torrieri wants to know a little bit more about where the info comes from determining a horse's running style. It's actually, the algorithm is looking at where they are in the early points of call. Is that correct?
That's correct. In previous races, early points of call, distance matches up and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, it looks at the horse's running style in previous races.
Gotcha. Okay. We had another question from Charlie Hughes. I think I know the answer to this, but I'm curious what you would say. He wants to know if a race, how would a race shape be assigned for a race that's very fast at the quarter, but then slowed down middle of the race?
The program looks at the horse's running style prior to the race. So if there's a lot of speed in the race, it's not really looking at fractions and
right.
quarter to the half and that kind of stuff. But if the speed horses who are expected to be close up are in fact close up, and if there's a lot of them and the race collapses and the closers end up winning the race or dominating the race, then it's going to come up as a race that favored the closers, regardless of the speed of the fractions. And if the reverse is true, where it's a race without a lot of pace in it, projected prior to the race, and the speeds end up holding on, then obviously it's a race that, in our opinion, that, you know, the speeds had the edge. It really doesn't look at the speed between the first and the second call. It's not looking for speed and fractions. It's looking for running styles and actual running of the race.
Right. His question would be more appropriate for some pace figures, like the Moss pace figures.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Thomas Sirocco wants to know, these designations are calculated for an entire day's card, not simply for a single race. Is that correct? I think, I'll put words in your mouth and tell me if I'm wrong. You're looking at a race by race independent of where it's run, right?
Yes. Yeah. Just every race is looked at.
Yeah.
Field racing. Yeah, every race is looked at in North America.
Right. So it's like a race at Aqueduct in the 6th race on April 15th is not necessarily going to affect the 6th race that day, or
no.
Each one is done individually.
No, there's no variance calculated or anything like that, no.
Yeah. All right, we had a couple other questions from folks that wanted to go back and look at a few Derby runners before we wrap. We've got about 5 more minutes before we're at the top of the hour. Chris Garofalo wants to know what would you make of a horse like Fellowship, who seems to have a stack of varying races favoring speed and closers, and the last few finished about the same from both ends of the pace spectrum. Just a horse dedicated to show no matter what the race shape, or is he one you would upgrade or downgrade based on some of his previous races?
Well, he's dedicated to show in his last two, because I used him in the exactas and bet him to win both times. He was dedicated to show. I liked him off the Holy Bull. I thought that was a big effort, and the race shape confirms. He ran a big race for third there. But then the last two races, you know, he had the flow in his favor. He only ended up third. You know, he's probably not fast enough to win this. This may be, you know, this is, I'm not saying exactly the track's favored speed or they didn't favor speed, you know, but when you get into what Plowboy Jake was saying earlier, the kind of horse you can come up with if the horse is running on a speed track is about the only excuse I would come up with a horse like that. Otherwise, I think I've learned my lesson and found out that he's probably not fast enough for these, especially if there's not a lot of pace in the Derby.
Yeah, well, it's a good point. I mean, there's a difference between whether he's fast enough to win the Derby, where he's going to need a little help to even get into the starting gate, versus whether or not you would upgrade or downgrade off of some of his previous efforts. He could still be a very good horse that might have some good races in him a little bit later this year, whether or not he's able to win next Saturday.
Yeah, I would downgrade him off his last two because of the fact that he had the flow in his favor and didn't catch up. But, if he takes a drop in class and meets lesser, then he certainly can win. I mean, the race 3 back in the Holy Bull, he ran really well. I mean, he ran well for third against the flow. I just don't know if he's, fast enough to catch up to a horse like Nyquist. But the extra distance
Right.
obviously helps him. And, if he gets some help up front, he could pick up a part, sure. But all things being equal, in a race without a lot of pace, I don't like him unless he gets pace.
I'm going to scroll back to Mohaymen because we've got a couple people asking about his race in the Florida Derby, where he seemingly may have been, I don't know, you tell me, against or with the pace flow.
That's interesting. I'm glad you guys brought this up because it is open to interpretation, just like a lot of things in racing, including speed figures. You have to interpret the symbol in some cases. Here's a horse that's close up and ended up losing ground late. The fact that he's going a mile and an eighth there, and the fact that a mile and a 16th 2 back when he was clearly with the flow, and 3 back in the Holy Bull, he was with the flow. He was close up in a race that favored the speeds. I was against him in the Florida Derby because of that, because of the 2 races that he ran prior to that, and the race flow was in his favor both times. He came up with the big figures. I was against him in the Florida Derby. I thought it was a race that he certainly was vulnerable at a short price. I would consider that race to be an excuse for him because he was too close, a little close up. Then again, Nyquist was close up. So, if you're looking at it in the context of the Derby, I don't like this horse at all. But
Yeah.
if you're looking at it in the context of, do you want to give him an excuse for his last race based on the flow? Yeah, maybe you could. But, then again, like I said, Nyquist, what's his excuse? I mean, he was, close up to the pace as well. And this horse, Mohaymen, kind of fell apart there late. I think it kind of exposed what it really does in terms of race shape is it validates the 2 previous race shapes. He was with the flow in the Holy Bull, he was with the flow in the Fountain of Youth, and then he came back. And to me, that's a perfect example of a horse who doesn't run to his figures that were aided by the race shapes in his previous races.
Right.
I don't think he's good enough.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you as well, and I guess we'll see how much money he takes. That's kind of the big question. If he's overlooked and he becomes value, then maybe you can make a case for improvement. All right, we're at the top. Go ahead, Kenny.
Here's the yin and yang that we talked about earlier with that. Now he comes back in the Derby, maybe he's going to be close up to a controlled pace. Maybe he's got the flow in his favor this time. He's going to probably run well. Personally, I couldn't bet him myself, but I can see him improving upon the last race, obviously.
Right. All right, well, we're at the top of the hour. It's been a very, very interesting and informative hour. We got a lot of really good questions. Hopefully everybody found it interesting and got some good information out of it. If you want to watch the replay or if you missed part of it, will be posted at drf.com/YouTube later today. This is Mike Hogan. Thank you very much, Kenny. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Mike. Take care, everybody.
And thanks to everyone that watched today. This is a DRF.com presentation.